My parents never took me anywhere. I'd never left our small town before the age of 25. Once I did, I realized just how much I love the road. Most truckers would tell you that they have a list of freaky shit a mile long that they've seen while on the road, and in my 30 years, I thought I had already seen the worst. I was so unbelievably wrong. I was on my way from San Antonio towards Dallas after making a 7 o'clock drop-off. I still had a few hours to go when I stopped at a small diner off 35. I had missed lunch that day and had to piss like a racehorse. I pulled my rig into the gravel lot and parked around the side of the building. I locked up and jogged inside. When I first got inside, there were a few things I noticed right away. One, the restaurant was empty. I don't mean there were only a few tables of diners. I mean there was nobody. There were no waiters, no cooks, no anyone. I took a second to look at the door to see the open sign blinking red. I found my way to the bathroom to relieve myself. I figured if anything, I would just use the restroom and leave to find a McDonald's or something at the next exit. However, when I exited the bathroom, I was no longer the only person in the restaurant. Sitting at the bar was an older gentleman. His gray hair was neatly gelled away from his face. He had a dark gray suit that was fitted nicely onto his slender frame. He appeared to be in his 70s and was taking a drag of a cigar as I stepped out. He didn't immediately acknowledge my presence, but after taking another drag, he looked over at me. He nodded lightly and patted the stool beside him, gesturing for me to sit down. I was hesitant at first, but figured the guy was probably harmless. I walked over and sat down beside him, looking around for any employees, but saw none. "Can I get you a drink?" he asked, his voice lower than I expected, and gruff from what must have been years of chain smoking. "Oh, just a water." He eyed me for a few seconds. His dark brown, wrinkled eyes scanned my face up and down a few times before he made a move to stand. I noticed he used a cane as he made his way around the counter to the sink. As he began to fill up my cup, he glanced back at me. "We don't get a lot of customers here," he said, sitting a full cup in front of me, leaning his arms onto the bar, watching me. "Do you work here?" I asked, taking a small sip. The man chuckled softly. "Sort of. I own it." I nodded and looked around once more. "How long you been here?" "As long as I can remember," he answered, standing up straight. "You hungry?" he asked, turning away from me. "Yeah, I could go for a burger or something." The man nodded and disappeared to the back for a few minutes. He returned with the juiciest burger I'd ever seen, accompanied with a pickle and side of chips. He gently sat in front of me and then slowly made his way back around the bar to the seat beside me. I quickly dug into the meal, realizing how hungry I was. The man watched me for a few moments before speaking up again. "What's your name?" I swallowed the bite in my mouth and glanced over. "Steve," I said quickly before shoving more burger into my mouth. The man nodded lightly. "I'm Nick." He pulled a cigarette out of his suit pocket and lit it. He held it toward me, offering a hit. I politely declined and finished up my food. "Thanks for the dinner. It was delicious. What do I owe you?" I asked, standing up. Nick looked over at me and smirked. "Son, people who want more than just a meal." I stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond to that. Okay." Nick stood up and walked over to the entrance. "Food is not what you truly desired tonight." I stared at him for a few seconds, unsure if he was joking or just totally off his rocker. I laid a 10 on the table and walked toward the door, brushing against him as I shoved it open. I began to make my way across the parking lot towards my truck glancing back at the diner. Nick was still standing at the entrance, grinning wildly. I climbed in my truck and drove off, glad to be rid of the strange place and its owner. Nick remained in my mind for the rest of the night. A lot of the drive was just empty road, no real identifying markers. So I thought it was weird that I had driven for about an hour and had only come across one other building. I really had to pee again, and another small diner was the only building I'd seen. I pulled into the lot and got out, rushing inside. I almost pissed my pants then, and there, when I looked around, the diner was empty. I looked over toward the bar area, seeing a familiar gray head of hair. Nick spun around to face me and chuckled softly. "Nice to have you back, Steve." Now, I was partly scared and partly furious. "What the fuck do you want with me?" I yelled at the man. "How the hell did you do this?" Nick stood up slowly and made his way over to me. "It's what you want, not me." He gestured to a nearby booth, and I reluctantly sat down across from it. "So, Steve," he started, "tell me a little bit about yourself." I did not have time for this shit. "Bite me," I said harshly, almost spitting at him in the process. I wasn't sure why I was so angry, but perhaps my fear had just manifested in that way. How could I be at the same diner that I had driven away from over 50 miles ago? Nick shook his head softly, laughing. Steve. He looked up, meeting my eyes with his dark ones. I knew they were brown, but they were so dark that they almost looked black in the low setting of the diner. "Don't be so hostile. I'm trying to help you." I studied his face for a moment, trying to find some kind of sign that this was some elaborate joke. Perhaps some camera crew was going to jump out of the back telling me I was on some new prank show. No. No camera crew ever came. "I don't understand," I said softly, finally calming down enough to try to rationalize things. "There's something you want, and I can give it to you, my boy." I looked up at him once more. His face showed no expression. It was virtually unreadable. I had no idea what he was talking about, so I repeated my previous statement. "Tell me about yourself, Steve. Maybe it'll begin to make sense to you then." I looked down at the table. I hadn't talked about it before, but I was ready to. If it got me out of this shithole, I'd do anything. "I've been a trucker for 30 years now." Nick nodded, leaning back in his booth. "Why?" What kind of question was that? I like driving? He studied me for just half a second before nodding. "You like driving or running?" What the hell is that supposed to mean? Nick shrugged, folding his arms over his chest. "Exactly what I said." I glanced out the diner window, looking out towards the interstate for a few seconds before Nick cleared his throat, bringing my attention back to him. "What happened before you became a trucker, Steve?" I looked down at the table, unable to make eye contact with him. "I had a family," I said, almost whispering. "You did. A wife and a beautiful daughter," he said, a smug look on his face. I snapped my head up. How the hell did he know that? Nick must have caught on to my surprise pretty quickly because he responded to the question I hadn't actually asked. "I know everything, son." "Then why did you ask?" I said, beginning to get angry again. "Because you have to be the one to say it." "Yeah? I had a wife and a daughter, but they're gone now. And they've been gone a really long time. Nick nodded, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. And what happened to him, Steve? They're dead. From a fire. Nick watched me quietly for a few moments. I'm very sorry to hear that, Steve. He wasn't lying. He was being sincere in his sympathy. I nodded quietly, not meeting his eyes. I don't mean to be a buzzkill, Steve, but nice people don't end up in my diner, he said, abruptly ending the awkward silence that had been occurring. I looked up at him. What? Nick folded his arms across his chest once more. What really happened that night, Steve? I shook my head. I already told you. It was a fire. Nick nodded softly. And what caused this fire? Faulty wiring, I said, leaning back in my booth. Nick nodded once more. I could finally make something out of his face. He was thinking. The gears in his mind were turning as he thought of his response. You don't believe that, he finally said. Of course I do. That's what they said. Nick chuckled softly. But we both know that wasn't cause of the fire. He sat up straight, leaning in close to me. We both know that coincidence is what saved your ass. He laughed softly again. Did the faulty wires pass out with a lit cigarette as well? I stood up, shoving the table toward him, hard. What are you insinuating? I yelled, getting in his face. I grabbed him by his suit collar, his cane falling to the ground. I drew back my fist, ready to hit him. It was a drunken mistake, Steve, he said to me, not even flinching at my sudden outburst. I looked over him. Who the hell are you? Nick laughed quite loudly this time. If I told you, you'd never believe me. I let go of his shirt collar, picking up his cane for him before straightening him up again. What is it you want? Nick leaned against his cane, watching me. I already told you. It's about what you want. I watched for a minute before chuckling softly to myself. You can't give me what I really want, I said to him, looking him in the eyes. He didn't break eye contact as a wide smile spread across his face. Try me. I stared at him for a long time, searching for any deceptiveness. I found none. I sat back down at the booth and sighed deeply, staring at the ground. I felt tears pricking my eyes as my throat swelled a bit. I want them back, I croaked out. Nick watched me for a long time before speaking up again. I can do that. I looked up at him, tears now actively flowing down my cheeks. That's not funny. Nick shrugged. Who said I was joking? I stood up, getting in his face again. Do not fuck with me, old man. He held his hands up defensively. I'm not. I let go, and he crossed his arms. I can give them back to you, for a price. I rolled my eyes before locking eyes with him again. What's the price? I asked, genuinely interested in what this crazy old bat would want. Nick chuckled quietly. Well, Steve, all I want from you is your soul. My soul? I asked, almost in disbelief. Yeah, it was official. This guy was insane. After you die, of course, Nick said, making sure I fully understood the terms. I'd come to collect in another 30 years. I laughed loudly. This old bag wouldn't even be alive in 30 more years. Hell, he looks like he could drop over in the next 30 minutes. So I agree to give you my soul after I die, and you will bring my wife and daughter back from the dead? I couldn't even believe what I was saying. Was I in some kind of movie? Perhaps I was dreaming. Exactly, Nick replied, short and sweet to the point. Who are you? I asked, wondering what kind of drugs this dude was on. I'm the devil, he responded, far more casually than I would have expected. I looked at him. So, you're the devil and you want my soul? Nick shrugged. Yeah. I shrugged. Hell, I won't need it after I die. I laughed again. If I agree to this, will you let me go? I just want to go home. I needed to entertain him, humor him so I could get on with my life. Hopefully, I'd leave and never have to think of this weird night ever again. Nick nodded, extending his hand to me. Yeah, you won't see me for another 30 years. I shook his hand firmly. It was far hotter than I expected. I quickly withdrew my hand. Looking at it, turned beet red. It looked like it was burned. When I looked back up from my injury, Nick was gone. Not just that, the whole diner was gone. I looked around. I was pulled off into a small field, my truck parked about 100 yards away on the side of the road. I looked around once more, but saw nothing in any direction. I quickly jogged back over to my rig and pulled back onto the interstate. I drove straight home, not wanting to stop again for fear I'd never make it back. I arrived around midnight, which is nearly impossible considering the drive was 4 hours, and I'd spent the last 2 in that stupid diner. It should have been closer to 3 or 4 in the morning. But no, it was like I'd never even stopped on the way home. As I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, looking around in the dark, I flipped the light switch and kicked off my boots. Steve, is that you, sweetheart? I heard a voice call from upstairs. I froze. That wasn't just anyone's voice. No, that was Christina's voice. My Christina. The one I'd lost all those years ago. I heard the patter of little feet scamper across the floor upstairs. Daddy? This was impossible. My little girl had died 30 years ago. She was only 7 and the prettiest girl I'd ever met. I thought every day how I had taken her life from her and her mother. Christina? Marie! I called back, in disbelief at what I was hearing. Was it possible that Nick was telling the truth? He really was the devil? That meant that I'd really sold my soul. It didn't matter now, though. I had 30 years before I had to pay up. I had 30 years to spend with my family. 30 years I thought I'd miss out on. I was deep in thought as my wife and daughter finally made their way down the steps. I realized then that Nick was without a doubt the devil himself. I'd made a deal with the devil, and the reason I knew was because he was notorious for being a trickster. I looked over my wife and child, trying not to vomit. Their skin was black and charred, falling off in chunks all over their body. Their clothes were melted and fused into their skin, and they absolutely reeked. I knew then, that these next 30 years with them would be the worst 30 years. Worse than the 30 years I spent grieving over them. They were now a constant reminder of what I had done. And the worst of it is that I sold my soul for this. And I think I know exactly how he's going to kill me. I may as well take the smoke detectors down now. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that terrifying story by ShabbyBoa on Reddit. I'll leave a link to the story down below, so you should be sure to check out the author's other works. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to hit the like button, click subscribe, and the little bell so you can be notified when my videos pop up. Tell me how you're enjoying this October extravaganza in the comments section down below. If you have a story you want me to read, go ahead and send it to me at darknesstales@gmail.com. Or you can find me on social media on Twitter @darknesstales_ or Instagram @darknesstales. And as always, my Darkness Militia, have a terrifying evening.